Briony was asked to write this book on Ian McTaggart Cowan by the Cowan family. It's really it's a scholarly work, but it's also totally referenced, but really highly readable. And again, I recommend it tremendously. So I see that if I turn the page and back to where I started. So, Briony.
Thanks. Thank you for your kind introduction, and glad to be here. And it's fun to be here with my sister, Caroline. So thanks to all the organizers, and thanks to all the people tuning in. Okay, so I think so. Can the audience see can I set off and start? All right, so I just wanted to first acknowledge there's an awful lot of people that were behind this book, and then there was a whole tour. We went around northern BC to a lot of the communities that had, really been part of Ian McTaggart Cowan's legacy. He spent a lot of time traveling and doing his research, and so we had a grant from the Beaty Biodiversity Museum to try and get, which was part of Ian's philosophy from the start, which was always to share knowledge and to try and bring people together and share knowledge about everybody has experiences in the natural world. And he had a huge regard for anybody that was on the land, whether they were a subsistence hunter or a trapper, whatever they were doing. He had a high regard for local knowledge and citizen science. And that's reflected in both the people that supported this book, but as well as he was an academic, and huge list of publications. And anyway, this is just a tribute to all these various organizations, including the Victoria Natural History Society, as it was then, Nature Vancouver, and it's kind of fun to be here. He was president 80 years ago, right when he had just started taking up his position at the University of British Columbia Zoology Department. It's kind of their wildlife management, their first kind of foray into wildlife management. So I'm going to start at the beginning, and I just realized that this screen doesn't have my notes on it. I'm sure there's a way to make that happen, but oh well, I might have to remember this. If anyone has a quick idea. Actually, oh, whoops, what happened there? How does that work? Oh dear, sorry, I thought it would come with this screen notes.
The next block inside your pen, is that your notes there?
Yeah, and it doesn't, usually you have what you see as you read, and then what's on the screen is different. Okay.
Is that your notes?
I'm just
that works. What you're saying, Briony, is when you have two screens, when you have your
oh, okay. So, but it doesn't work with this.
if you have just one screen, there's no place to
There's no place to go. Okay, right. Okay, well, I don't have any notes, but that's okay. I will wing it. I was doing this talk from 2016 to about 2018, but I've written 2-3 more books since then. So if I hesitate on the dates without my notes, I hope you'll understand. Ian was born in 1910 in Edinburgh, and he came from this incredible lineage of naturalist scientists, people like the Hutton, James Hutton, and Hutton Balfour. These were botanists, geologists that were really, James Hutton's perceived as called the father of geology, really, and also really had sort of the fundamental start to theories of evolution, which his subsequent family members like Hutton Balfour and then Darwin it was a very kind of rich brew of the Scottish Enlightenment. And this is the tradition that Ian was born into. So he left Edinburgh when he was about 3 years old. But when I sat down and we first met and I was asking him about all his influences, Scotland was a very big influence on him. Even at the age of 3, he was observing the world. And he remembered that what he remembered about Edinburgh at the time is that there was a plague of rabbits. And so what happened is that there was sort of feral rabbits being brought up and pushing the hares north. And it really started to inform him about the kind of role of prey and predator. So from a very early age, he was kind of fascinated by small mammals, and this kind of Scottish tradition of both enlightenment and also the reasons why there was a plague in Edinburgh at the time is that the gamekeepers had been slaughtering all the birds of prey and predators. And so Scotland was its wildly unbalanced ecosystem. And it was always this kind of sort of the best and the worst of Scotland came over to Canada. But it left this very lasting impression, and rodents was certainly one of them. And these are all of the photographs I'm showing you of animals are Ian's. He was a great photographer, and he had such a knack that I don't know about you, but can you imagine trying to get these photographs? Wait till you see some of them. It's like, how did he do it? So mice in particular were a sort of enduring theme throughout his life, and especially around Vancouver, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And not only mice, but the whole relationship of prey and predator, and what happens when you remove predators out of the system, and what happens to populations. And this was kind of what was informing his thinking all around. So when we talked, he often talked about these really strong childhood sort of images. Here's another, I'm going to see if anyone knows what this is. Yeah, hare, which one? No, did you? So this is Lepus americanus pallidi. It was the Washington hare. And when he arrived at the UBC campus, I'm going to jump around because it's hard to, when talking about Ian, it's very hard to know whether to follow a chronological track or whether to follow a sort of species track. So anyway, we'll jump around. But the hares, he'd been well acquainted with hares in Scotland, the retreat of the hares as they were sort of pushed out by the feral rabbits. Well, the same thing happened in Vancouver. And when he first came to the campus in 1929 or something like that, there was an explosion of Washington hares. How many of you have seen a Washington hare around, UBC and campus? No one even knows, has ever even heard of them. And so his journals and his scientific reports are already in full swing by this time. So if you want to read about the wildlife of UBC, that's one of his first peer-reviewed articles, is looking at this kind of like big kind of imbalance when the hare population shot up because people started shooting all the predators, the cougars, the wolves, the birds of prey. Anyway, this particular snowshoe hare was named by him. He's got many animals named after him, and he's named many animals. So this is just one of many. Okay, so I said I'd start with small mammals. The reason I love small mammals, and I think it's a great place to start with Ian, is that if any of you have the Mammals of BC, it's that beautiful little provincial guide, Ian wrote it. And in the very beginning, it starts, small mammals are secretive things. And he goes on to describe their cryptic coloring and how well they do it, hiding themselves and finding, sort of strategies for avoiding every kind of predator in the world. Well, this particular photograph, I think, is taken by Ian Hamilton Lang. Hamilton Mac Lang, but it is in Huntington, yeah. So this is where the races were, and I'll get to the races in a little while. At this stage, Ian's 17, and the small mammals of sort of the Fraser, south of the Fraser, were incredible. When I started reading these kind of journals about the kinds of small mammals that they were trapping, and he was he really got into small mammal trapping at a very early age. And I'll go into a little bit about why. But these are, again, some of the sort of legacy of Ian's early affection and early interest in small mammals. So in here you've got a long-tailed shrew, a mole shrew, a white-footed deer mouse, a jumping mouse, a smaller vole, which isn't, I can't remember if I don't have my notes, so which species. Then there's a Townsend's vole, and he's had a Townsend's vole named after him, subspecies that lives up in Triangle Island, and a mole. I think it's Townsend's mole. These were just found in one little day of foraging at Huntington, right on the border. So this kind of part of Vancouver is really high, or was. I mean, you can imagine the changes that have gone on in the last 100 years. But this used to be kind of the epicenter of small mammals. And it's kind of the where these northern grassland species are kind of pushing up against this big impenetrable Fraser River, and then they're kind of amalgamating there. Okay, so that was his first big love with small mammals. That was from his early influences in Scotland. The second big influence on him was mountains. He remembers the mountains, starting with sort of, Arthur Seed and the Scottish mountains. He has even at 3, had strong memories of mountains. His memory was prodigious. He could remember it. He would say, oh, I remember sitting, at the Tonquin Valley, and he'd be able to describe the species and the dentition and the sex and the weight of a particular, small mammal that he had seen sort of crawling around. So he was quite a source of, I have so many notes. I have like tons of tomes and tomes of notes. And as he did too, he kept copious journals, which is why this is such a tome, because he was recording his whole life. So mountains were hugely important to him. And I'll talk about his time up in the Athabasca and the Tonquin and the work in the Rockies. But this gives you a little inkling of the man, I always feel. You can see the little kid by this mountain goat. He had to climb up this cliff, and he didn't have telephoto lenses. People didn't have those telephoto lenses in those days. And he had to climb up the cliff and get this picture. I don't know if you have climbed in this country, but it's an incredible photograph. So anyway, so at the age of 3, armed with these influences, he came out to Vancouver, and they lived, it was on Nicholas Street, and need to pay tribute to, so in the audience on Zoom is Anne Shaw, I believe, and Anne could send me a chat note and remind me. I think it's Nicola and something street down, right? It ran down to the beach. Anyway, this is him as a little boy, endlessly curious and pointing to everything. And one of the things that he pointed to, that he remarked and told me the story, is he remembers spotting his first sharp-tailed grouse. And this is right downtown Vancouver, right going down to the beach at English Bay. So I don't know if it's like Washington Hare. Has anyone seen any sharp-tailed grouse in Vancouver? Not lately. This is not a sharp-tailed grouse. This is what was a blue grouse. Everyone knows they've been the lumpers and the splitters. It's now city and dusky. Yeah. And grouse absolutely were another thing that just dominated his life. Grouse weave themselves in and out of his life all the way. And I think it started because and I'll get to a little bit, but he was really very practical about his interest in wildlife. Part of the reason he was interested is he liked eating it, and part of it was just hugely curious and loved being in the natural world. So the grouse populations had also exploded in Vancouver with all the clear cutting that was going on. Massive clear cutting, opening up all these spaces everywhere. The grouse suddenly expanded hugely, and there was grouse everywhere. Well, that didn't last very long. As these sort of mono, plantations crept back in, or not, but as the forest closed cover, all the structure, the old structure of the forest would have allowed for these little openings and leks for the grouse disappeared. And you suddenly had a style of forestry that was really not well adapted for grouse. And it was his observing of the grouse forest relationship that really put him on a campaign against clear-cut logging right from sort of the 40s onwards. And he was, people have been talking about stopping cutting the old growth for a very long time, 100 years, and we're still not listening. But it was through grouse that he had. And his students, I'll make reference to some of his students. There might be some students in this room. I don't know. Anyone here a student? Maybe some students on the Zoom, but he had hundreds of grad students, all of which loved him and went on to do amazing things. And two of the grouse experts, Fred Zwickel and Tom Bergerud. And I think, yeah, Caroline, you had Tom as a student. So one of the things that I really discovered when I started doing the biography of Ian McTaggart Cowan was this lineage. And I bet I could trace lineages for all of you back to very, individuals that had influenced you. And when you start looking at his influence across Canada, pretty much all roads lead to back to Ian, back to Rome. So the grouse work, in fact, one of my best friends on Salt Spring, who's a great grouse person, she taught at the University of Alberta. She had been trained by Fred Zwickel, and you got trained by Tom Bergerud, and the grouse work also had these wonderful kind of his affiliations with, trying to understand population dynamics, and because grouse are really interesting. They have these two kind of sort of phenotypes, I guess, or genotypes really. Very, very sort of cautious, or very sort of, pioneering and going out there. And they even have different calls, and there's sort of life strategies. I kind of call them, you could even name them political parties, because they sort of act like political parties. It's quite interesting. I won't say which is which. So his other big love was deer. And this is his and I'll, the deer had again threaded through his life and had some very profound impacts on his life, and which I will get to as we weave our way through. Not 100 years. He lived till he was 3 months shy of his 100th birthday. I think I'm going to stop around when he's about 45. So I could go on, but I think you probably want to get home tonight. He had a very long life, a very full life, a very, very productive life, and so many stories. So as he was growing up, this is the mountains of North Van. The family had, arrived in Vancouver. His father had promptly lost his job after the First World War. He had to go and start being a market gardener up in North Van, and the family moved. And that's when Ian got into hunting to fill the pot, his subsistence hunting, and really roamed the Hollyburn and Black Mountain. This is Ian here. This is his sister, Joan Zink, who became a very highly regarded landscape architect and botanist at UBC. And his brother Patrick McTaggart Cowan became the first president of SFU. He was a meteorologist, and he set up the very first climatic change, living with climatic change. This is back in 1975. He was a meteorologist that absolutely recognized climate change. He was noticing all the impacts, especially up in the north. All of them did. All of them were talking about climate change as early as 50s, as I can find in their journals. But this 1975 program that Patrick set up was to try and educate the bureaucrats about climatic change. Too bad it didn't work. No one listened to these, federal, Dominion, whatever, meteorologists. And we're left with the mess we're in now. So this is a great photograph. This is taken by Hamilton Mac Lang, who was one of his very early mentors. And if those of you who don't know who he is, there's several books about him now. And I think Trevor, there we go, one of the authors of Hamilton Mac Lang's. We could give an entire 3-hour lecture on Hamilton Mac Lang, because he was an amazing photographer, an artist, a writer, a naturalist, and a great mentor. And this is one of Lang's photographs of a Boy Scout with a hawk. It could have been Ian. It actually isn't, but I love this photograph so much because Ian joined the Boy Scouts, and it was while he was in the Boy Scouts that he had this profound meeting. And what happened was I think it was the Burrard, or was it the Burrard or the North Shore Boy Scouts, and they joined, and they got this notice coming from the Dominion scientists that said, any Boy Scout that keeps a bird journal, will win a prize for the best, or for keeping a journal. So that's what started Ian on keeping a journal of the birds that he saw. And he, in his, typical fashion, was incredibly precocious little boy, and kept this very detailed journal. So he sent it off to the bird observatory, a Western migratory bird officer at the time, who is Jim Munro. And Jim Munro, I don't know if any of you got any recollection of Jim Munro, but he's one of these people that crops up everywhere as a kind of gentle, kind, supportive birder that would support anyone. Any child that wrote him a little journal describing the birds that he saw, he would write back with very detailed and very constructive comments. So that's what happened. This conversation ensued, and the new book by Taverner on the Western birds, I think Munro and, gosh, I'm going to get it mixed up. This is where I need my notes. But the first volume of the Western birds of Canada was coming out in 1926. So we're right at 1925, 1926. And so the Ian is keeping this journal in North Vancouver at a time when there are no guidebooks for, to say what's what, just local knowledge. And people like the Mondays, Phil and Don Monday, are living up in Hollyburn, and they're helping this boy out a bit. And then he gets this chance to communicate with the real Dominion scientist. So he writes to him and he says, I think I found a house finch. And Munro writes back and says, no, you won't have found a house finch, because there aren't any house finches in BC. They're all down in the south, but what you've seen is probably a purple finch. And so that was the first correspondence. And we've got some of these letters, and they're beautiful, from sort of 1925. So Munro at the time was part of this group of scientists, and I'll just finish this story first. So one of the other things that they corresponded about was cormorants. At the time, there were no double-crested cormorants in British Columbia. Little known fact, did anyone know that? They had been hunted out by early settlers. You can imagine they were kind of sitting cormorants, right? These great, big, obvious, conspicuous nests. People were taking their eggs. They had lived, quite happily with all indigenous people for thousands of years, but the settlers came and wham, they were wiped out within probably 40 or 50 years. So Jim Munro was a great documenter of what he was witnessing in the short period of this colony, and the impacts on it. And so all of these little items went into his book, and he started documenting on Mendardi Island this return of the double-crested cormorants and noting their kind of return and revival and trying to raise awareness about their protection. And so places, it was called Bear Island at that stage. There were many Bear Islands, you know, kind of settler names, imaginative settler names. Okay, so why is there a bison on this picture? So this stems to what was going on in Canadian sort of wildlife discourse at the time. There was a whole big compound of plains bison that had been rescued, and then they'd been moved up into Alberta, and then they started to breed. Remember, this is a species that has virtually been just about gone into extinction. And so all the wildlife biologists that were really interested in conservation were very interested in the fate of this small herd. But because they hadn't created enough space for these bison, they decided they were going to ship them off to Wood Buffalo National Park. And so all the scientists said, you can't, these are different species. They're going to infect the different herds with tuberculosis, so they might interbreed. It's going to be a disaster. Well, the government didn't listen, and the scientists wrote a letter that went across the nation, you know, calling out their political masters, and they were all threatened with being dismissed. So they formed a secret society, and Jim Monroe was part of it. In Hamilton MacLang was part of it. And this fellow, Hoyes Lloyd, who was a Dominion scientist, who was really the spearhead of it all. And they got in touch with their US colleagues, people like Aldo Leopold, if people have heard of Aldo Leopold, father of American ecology, and they formed a secret society. But it all began with people like Monroe and these Canadian scientists. And their whole philosophy was, we have to get the public supporting the natural history of North America, because it's being destroyed. There's not enough political support for it. So we need to start educating the young. We need to start getting out guidebooks. We need to start getting into, you know, magazines and start natural history societies, and we need to start educating people. So this was the start of the B. It was called the B, and it was actually short for the Brotherhood of the Venery, which is the deer coming swirling back. They were all scientists. They were also, many of them were subsistence hunters as well. And most of them were these traumatized victims of World War I, who really needed to get away from trauma, and so shared that kind of love of the natural world. One of them, Percy Taverner, had a terrible stammer. The others, some of them were, you know, people that just were wanting to protect sort of, you know, what they saw as this disappearing natural you know, incredible legacy. So Ian made friends with Monroe, and then they kind of brought him into the circle. And that was where this correspondence went on, and they said, you know, we found a young acolyte. He's just a top-notch little naturalist, and we think he's the real thing. So that was the name of the book. That's what named the book. And he was a subsistence hunter, and this is a picture that Hamilton MacLang took of him when he'd come over to Comox and climbed up, you know, up into one of the hills behind and brought him back a deer. This is him on his motorbike. This is Lang on his motorbike, called Barking Betsy. I don't know where he is. He's somewhere crazy. Okay, so this is Black Mountain. This is Black Mountain before all the lifts and Black Mountain. Oh my goodness. So the journals that Ian kept are all available at the UVic library. and they've all been transcribed and all the photographs. And if you want to do some reading about what was there, you can see what was up in Black Mountain back in the 20s. And, you know, just it really speaks to this shifting baseline of what was and what is now. The other person that he met, so this was right at the time when they created the Victoria Natural History Society by Davidson. Davidson was a botanist. Many of you will know this. David was a botanist, and the botanist and the zoologist fell out. So they created two natural history societies, and Ian was part of the zoologists, and Davidson and the botanists went in one direction, and they called it 2 points to the caliper. And because of that, he met Kenneth Racey. And Kenneth Racey is also his father-in-law now. And Anne, if you're on Zoom, this is her grandfather. So Kenneth Racey was a mammologist and ornithologist. He was really very, very active with the American Ornithological Association. And he was also a member of the Bee. And the Racey family traveled all over British Columbia doing collections for the Ontario, because it was provincial, I mean, the national, or what's it called now, I need my notes, National Museum of whatever it was then, later the Natural History Museum. And he would take his kids, including his lovely daughter, Joyce. They're standing quite close, as you can see. I think this is up near Chesapeake Lake in the Chilcotin, and they would be out there collecting, looking for small mammals. This is probably looking for some, you know, one of the many voles. And this is Racey looking, yeah, this is Kenneth and this is Ian. And they traveled extensively. And this was, Ian just became his, you know, right-hand assistant. And here's another picture of Mac Lang, because he got his first job. So they back and forth correspondence. He's the real thing, hire him. So Mac Lang hired him and took him to Newgate, which is right where this, I mean, if you go there now, there's just this god-awful reservoir, the Kanuska Reservoir. But Newgate in 29 was an incredible place. And that's, I think it's Ethel and his wife, and they spent the summer looking for flying squirrels and all the different subspecies of flying squirrels. These are just little babies that he reached in, photographed and put back. I mean, when you read the journals of Newgate, it's astonishing to read them. They were finding, like, literally, like, I mean, I find it like it's yippee if I find, you know, 5 buffalo heads in a day. This is, I mean, the number they would find. Oh, I found 5 nests of flying squirrels and 3 yellow badger dens, and here's a yellow badger. They were really worried about all these species. And it was also in his journals, he talks about the hardship that he was witnessing for the people living in that valley, who had all been subjected to living on the reserve. They weren't allowed out. They weren't allowed to hunt in their own territory. And so Ian's kind of sensitivity to what was going on was certainly ahead of his time. It wasn't the usual, you know, ignoring what was going on, because he was being taught by Hamilton Mac Lang that the best knowledge holders were the people that live and hunt and trap and sustain themselves. So there's a lot of discussion at this time around the badgers and the fate of the badgers, the flying squirrels. And then they went off into the Rockies, and they did some what they called saddlebag science. This is with Frank Bryant and his daughter Kathleen. They're prowling around the Rockies. They're in a big brule. You can see that the big fires, the big burns of 1911 or 1910, 1911 have really moved right through all the the Northern Rockies, or the mid-center, sort of around Jasper area. And they were collecting all sorts of specimens for the museums, and you know, taking inventories, and so working again for the national museums. This is a saddlebag science photograph, which I love. And just these incredible, you know, summers just out there learning. One of the things that they were looking for was beavers. The beavers had been so trapped out, there were no beaver. And so he finds a beaver, and then promptly kills it, which actually that was, you have to get used to. I say that Ian didn't have one skeleton in his closet. He had 30,000 skeletons in his closet. So, you know, if you're squeamish, but you know, like that was what went on. That was specimens. And I think this was, you know, and I brought one of his specimens, which I'll show you. This is a 3D printer of one. But again, beaver wove their way in through his life as well. He was very cognizant that there were a lot of people that survived on beaver as a subsistence. And his later work up in the north was all about trying to reintroduce the beaver, get the wetlands, the relationship between wetlands, beaver, healthy landscapes. He'd really seen it, and he really embodied these animals. You get that talking to all his old students. I mean, I did a lot of interviewing of 90-year-olds, and one of the things that many of his students and his colleagues who worked with him said is that you could put any fur in his hands and he could tell the species just by feeling the fur, which is an incredible thing, really. So beaver, he actually worked with, I think it was quite, there was a big beaver reintroduction program, and I'm trying to remember the name of them. If I have my notes, up in the sort of grassy mountain kind of area where they were bringing all these beavers back to try and, you know, restore this landscape. So this is here we are with the skull. Bighorn sheep were one of his great, like another kind of like loves. And he influenced people like Val Geist, some of these sort of, you know, penultimate scientists on ungulates. And just, he would, you know, his journals, he would just sit and watch these animals for days and weeks on end, and really trying to understand the whole, you know, he would be constantly sort of thinking about, you know, the evolutionary, like what on earth could put this amount of investment into just like fighting against a competing male. Like what a crazy, so he had this beautiful sort of humorous take on everything about life, you know, like what are these crazy adaptations that we do just to find the right mate, and you know, so I think a very sort of, you can imagine his lectures. I mean, his lectures would be packed. Apparently at UBC, they had to call the fire police all the time because there would be more than, you know, 100 people more than the auditorium could sit, because there'd be so many students, because he'd always start every lecture with sex, and all the students would turn up, you know, they watched. He said that's the best thing to start with. They're not interested in protozoas, I can tell you. So, but prior to getting to UBC, so this is the Racy family. This is, so he's now declared his love for Joyce, and now he's got to prove himself. He's got to go out and find a job, or he's got to go and train up, and he's got to find a job. And this is his mother-in-law on the left, Eileen. And so first of all, it goes off, and there's this wonderful journal of Ian and Kenneth Racy going to Tofino for this incredible expedition where they go to Grice Bay. And I just was there like last 2 days ago. and the migration hasn't really started yet. But when I read about the migration in 19, whatever it was, it just makes me cry, you know, clouds of whimbrels, and they called them Hudsonian curlews then. Just the numbers of birds coming through. So Grace Bay is very equivalent to, you know, Fraser, those, I'm sure you birders out there, if any birders are watching. But the journals of Tofino are worth reading just to see the kind of rate, the diversity and numbers of what's going through at Grace Bay. And when they were there, they met up with Mr. Guppy. There were the Guppy brothers, and this is the same Guppy that named the fish Guppy, the family. I think that was an ancestor. And then Crispin Guppy, who writes the butterfly books. That's the same lineage. They're all naturalists and all quite eccentric. I'm sorry, Crispin, but your family are so fascinating to me. Because Ian writes about them heading off, you know, in little tiny boats to go out to Cleveland Island, also called Bear Island at that time. I'll get there in a minute. And then Cleveland Island then became the very first ecological reserve in British Columbia. But Cleveland Island, I mean, can you imagine you're traveling all the way to Tofino in 1929, and then you're getting in some little boat and going out to monitor seabirds. It's kind of, I just think that the people at a house that must have been scratching their heads like crazy Englishmen. So when they were on that trip, they also went and did this. They went up to just outside of Port Alberni to find the Vancouver Island marmot. So the Vancouver Island marmot had been first identified by science by Annie Alexander and Louise Kellogg. So they were a very kind of interesting couple who were both zoologists at the Berkeley School, the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. In fact, the money, Annie Alexander and Louise Kellogg's money, is what founded it. And they came up to Vancouver Island and had this incredible expedition in 1910, and they found this very unusual type of marmot. And so Kenneth and Ian decided to go up, and they thought they could do it in a day, and then they didn't, and then they got rained, and they had this, you know, didn't seem to matter at all. And then they found the marmots, and then Ian shot one. So we have one in the Provincial Museum, and I don't have a picture of it because I thought it'd be more interesting to see the work that he did. This is his later photograph of his students working with the marmot reintroduction or recovery program. But the Vancouver Island marmot, they also ate it because they were starving, because they'd only gone up for the day, but they ended up being up there for day and night and day. So they ate the marmot and came back with the skeleton. So it's quite a funny story he tells of bonding with his father-in-law. Kenneth Racy had a place up at Alto Lake. And so Ian spent a lot of time at Alto Lake, and there's beautiful journals of what is up at Alto Lake and Whistler at this time in the late 20s. And this is they would go up onto the glacier and start looking for sort of lemmings, bog lemmings, and all these little more small mammals that before I did this, I had no idea there were so many small mammals in British Columbia. And I don't think there's that many people that know that there's so many small mammals. There's like one small mammal specialist in British Columbia right now. I think this is Drummond's, no, it's a pika. This is a pika, and he loved pikas, absolutely loved pikas. And if I can show you one of his TV shows, he says the song of a pika in the mountains was just one of his most famous. And those of you I can see, it's just like, so he was an expert on pikas, of course, and probably wrote the only, monograph there is on sort of the subspecies, the 12 subspecies of pikas. He was a real splitter. But he was a splitter for a very good reason, because he felt that every place was distinct, and these were really important. These distinctions between subspecies were so important because they were so adapted, such a good observer, and they were so adapted to their place So, and they would go off on picnics, and he did this incredible expedition to find these water rats. Can't remember, Richardson's water rat. Anyone heard of that one? Yeah, they're sort of in disjunct populations. They're kind of left over from the ice ages. And a lot of these populations is where he got his idea about glacial refugia and speciation going on around glaciation. And he was very always thinking about sort of how did all these species come together? How did the ice move? Where did it come? You know, the migration of birds around like old phantom glaciers and how they had established their little sort of these strange disjunct populations. And this is with Joyce. This is he did a lot of work with birds trying to protect these are the trumpeters. They would very nearly came to extinction, and these were a pair that he'd spotted up in Alta Lake, and he worked to catch a poacher, and there's a very exciting thing in one of his journals about going after a poacher. Gosh, he was an expert on amphibians. I'll show you the amphibian one in a minute. I can't remember which species this is, to be honest. This is his brother. During the Depression, they were really broke, so they went gold digging. But after he dug his first pit, he started catching small mammals in the pit. So he stopped gold digging and started just doing small mammal research. It's such a cute little story because it's like he looked for gold for about a day, and then it was like, bored. And he went back to small mammals. Sorry, and it was all up around, you know, sort of Wells area, that kind of area. There's some big river systems that have a lot of, you know, sluice work, but they were totally into the small mammals up there. So he came back to UBC, and his great teacher was George Spencer, who was an entomologist. And if any of you have seen, there's probably the Spencer collection. George Spencer was the first person that I know of, I think, anywhere, one of the first scientists to draw attention to DDT. 1946, he did a lecture tour around British Columbia to warn farmers. He went to all the agricultural institutes and said, you got to be careful. These DDT is impacting our insect population. And George was Ian's instructor at UBC. And so this is his class at UBC. And I can't remember what I was going to say about that, but we'll you can see all his skulls. This is when, so he finished his degree at UBC and then went down to Berkeley, and he was studying where the black-tailed and the white-tailed deer diverged. And right, like he was sort of drawing the kind of geography of, or range of these species, and was kind of, you know, trying to figure out how these species were kind of why and where there was overlap. And so he would go around to all these old hunters who had skulls, and he was doing all the morphology of skulls, and he pieced together the sort of spatial ranges of these two species and their overlap. And that was his doctoral thesis. But even more importantly, he met Joseph Grinnell, who was an incredible and also part of the bee, and Annie Alexander, who was down there at the museum. She funded all his PhD work. So it was kind of not ironic, because they were all friends, but the brotherhood and the sisterhood had a very great sort of influence over his education. I don't have a watch, so can someone tell me that? Because if
Just before 8:30.
okay, so I could go on for hours, but I think maybe like a couple more slides and then we could put it to questions. Does that sound good?
No, another hour.
Yeah, these are his deer. This is the American Union of Ornithologists that Racy was a member of. I'm going to just go quickly through this because I just wanted to sort of hit some of the little highlights. The extent of his of his interests and ranges from, Western grebes to doing research where he individualized. He looked for individual traits so that he could see the kind of, family groupings of wolves. And he started the first campaign against the bounty and stopped the bounty in Canada. That's one of his big achievements. And it was through a lot of his wolf studies in the Rockies. He was responsible for the preservation of a lot of these bighorn sheep, raising awareness from them in the big Skaha area, north of or south of Penticton is named after him. He was in the provincial museum. This is the museum truck. This is after he finally got to marry Joyce when he had a full-time job at the provincial museum. And they would go off and do expeditions in the museum van. And one of them was to survey Tweedsmuir Park. I mean, this incredible journal about their trip through Tweedsmuir Park before it was flooded by the dam, and the whole place was turned into a bleak reservoir. But it was an incredible place when you read this. He wrote the first book on reptiles and amphibians. Although he's not the author, he just gave the manuscript to the next person coming into the province, because he he left the museum because he couldn't stand Kermode, who was a bit fraudulent, and he had left a letter outlining the areas in which it was embargoed. So I got to see this letter that had been embargoed for 50 years, outlining Frank Kermode's folly. Anyway, while he was at the museum, he really put a push on marine mammals and actually did the very first whale skeleton. And I am just going to take you through all these places and species of his life. This is up in Aklavik with Ward Stevens and the muskrats, where he was trying to help the Inuit and the Dene. They were just buckling, starving under colonial regs, and he was trying to tell them, like, oh, there's so many stories. There's some great stories about Aklavik. There he is on the water. Great stories about porcupines. And then when he went to Scotland, and this is when he was really inspired by people like Sir Peter Scott and Attenborough, and the people that were starting to do television programming in 1950s. And so that's when he started the very first television shows. And this is him filming for the Living Sea. And they were all filmed at Saturna. This is him filming up in the Chilcotin Lakes. And then he was at UBC all during this time. And I'll just keep clicking away. This is all up this is him working on the mouse, Keen's mouse, where they did determine with Bristol Foster. He's having breakfast, but he's also measuring mice, which is pretty typical of Bristol and Ian together. And he would be, looking and running around the province, trying to identify new marine mammals. This is on the Central Coast, where he'd been in 1939 doing a survey on shrews in the intertidal. Probably he was working for intelligence to find a good place to put a low-flying missile or low-flying plane radar station. But anyway, he knew the Central Coast like the back of his hand. His journals on the Central Coast are incredible. This is him in the International Whale Commission, the gray whales, his daughter Anne. Hello, Anne. And he was highly recognized by the Queen and Prince Philip, including going down to, they would go down to the rifle range, which is why the rifle range, I think, is protected, is because Ian would always take Prince Philip down there to go and look at birds. Yep, more pictures, just the range of his world. They've even had chitons and different mollusks named after him, because he became a Mopalia expert. That's his time as a chancellorship. And as even into old age, when I first met him, I mean, he was 90 when I met him. and I was half his age, and he was still so interested. Everything was fascinating. And this is him with Bristol, one of his students, and who'd done the work on the Keen's mouse, and his incredible interest in alpine flowers. And he pioneered ecotourism. And these are my last two slides. He'd always had this wish that there could be a museum that could contain the smallest mammal, pygmy shrew, and the largest mammal, blue whale. And he got it with the Beaty Biodiversity Museum. And he saw it several weeks before he died, and he saw his wish come true. So that's a very short version in McTaggart Cowan's life. Thank you. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, but
I take it all of this and more is in the book.
yes, it's all in the book. I did bring 2 books if anyone does want to buy a copy. Don't be daunted by the size. It won the BC Book Prize in 2016, and it's won 4 different prizes. So it's got to be. But as many of my older friends say, the writing's a little small. So I apologize, but it's a big life. You can kind of treat it. A lot of my friends treat it like each chapter is a book, so you don't have to wade all through it. Yes.
I just wanted to ask about these, especially the programs that you have along with you, and what is all the programs cover, and how is it?
Oh, well, I mean, those of you who are interested, let me show you because they're so cute.
In case the people on Zoom didn't hear, he was asking, somebody in the audience was asking about the TV program.
Yeah, so here's one of the TV programs. Here's Keen's mouse. This is in Haida Gwaii, what was then called Queen Charlotte Island. We can't hear it, unfortunately, because but you can kind of see. I wish you could, because you could see the range of his. This is him. He just goes up with the cameraman, and this was the web of life. And
Giving a commentary then?
yes, he's unfortunately we don't have we couldn't make it work. And this is one of his students getting probably an ancient murrelet. And the raven looking by, that looks good. And then showing me. I mean, you can imagine the show, right? I've got a few of this. So this is it. So that's one on Haida Gwaii. I'll show you this one too. Let's see if this one works. New share. Let's see this one. Love this one because it's he's up in sort of Skaha country or White Lake or something, and he's looking for spadefoot toads. He's like, well, here we are. It's lovely. He's sort of, let's look under this log. Oh, there's the little fellows. And then they do a little close up. I mean, he was, this was the start of natural history programming. And it was shown in Australia and New Zealand and England, and there's the spadefoot toad. It's so sad to me that we don't consider the extraordinary legacy more of our Canadian, like to me, it's a Canadian hero. And, so it was kind of like the best. These are fantastic. These are spadefoots. And then I got to show you one more. And I really wish I had the music and the songs with it, because it's.
If you stop sharing and start again, selecting the sound, you should be able to get the sound.
Okay, so stop share. So, here's the Sandhill cranes coming in. Let's see, share.
Right. And you have the sound playing. Okay, so I don't understand.
Yeah, it says share sound. I don't know why it's not playing at all. Oh, now it's echoing. Wow. Okay. I'll just show you one more. And it's. I'm going to show you what was called fur and feathers. Oh, this is too many screens going on. Oops, BBC. Okay. And movies. Fur and feathers. Okay. Okay.
Hello, boys and girls. Here we are again on Fur and Feathers. Remember last week I promised you I'd introduce you to Willie today? Well, you've just met Willie the Moose. But before we go any further, I'd like to introduce to you David Maxwell, who's come down with me this evening. He's interested in moose too, and together this evening we're going to have a look at this little moose friend of ours and tell you something about moose. I hope quite a few things that you didn't know before. Well, David, what do you think of our friend?
Well, he's got mighty long legs.
He's got mighty long legs, all right. And he's got a funny big nose. And he's lazy.
Say that again.
Let's get him out here so that people can see him, eh? Oh, no, that's fine. Oh, no, just relax. That's right, sure, you just relax. Now then.
Where did you get him?
Well, we got him up near Kamloops. You see, it happened this way. A very large and ugly cow moose had a baby. That was this little fellow, Willie. But
Okay. There we go.